way I look at it, I think I can do two things. First, I think I can help you deepen your understanding of the field, come up with a definition of environmental history, the sort that Glenn has you working on. We can talk about questions, concepts, etc. More conceptual kinds of things, how it is that environmental historians think and work. And that will be the first part. We'll do this in the first session. Then the next session, we can talk more about the actual content knowledge that's focused on the 19th century, because I understand that's what you're responsible for, right, 19th century. And I think what I'll do there is I'll focus on the Civil War. There are 3 chapters in my book, one that deals with slavery, one that deals with Abraham Lincoln, and one that deals with Gettysburg. And I've got some materials and some other things that might be useful to you. But since that's such a big moment in not only 19th century history, but American history overall, I'll focus on that. So I think it's great that you're going to have Elliot West and Thomas Andrews come and talk to you. Those are really 2 very prominent U.S. historians. Reading their books together, The Contested Plains and Killing for Coal, in a lot of ways I can't think of 2 better books for you to get an overview of U.S. environmental history as experienced in one place, Colorado. So they're really terrific scholars. They're great speakers. I think you'll like them a lot. And if you have time and you're thinking about it, just read those 2 books and you've got the broad overview. In a lot of ways, those 2 books provide a version of planetary history. It's planetary history is experienced in one spot. So you can extrapolate a lot out of those 2 books. Now, before we begin, let me just call your attention to some resources that I think might be useful to you. I realize you're all short on time. You've got a lot of things going on. Environmental history is not the only thing in your life, etc. But there are some online resources that I would highly recommend that you explore if you have time. Now, one of these is at the library website of my institution, Colorado State University. So you just Google Colorado State University libraries. This is how you get to it. It's a little bit buried. And so let me just show you how to get there. It's a website that I have put together with my colleague in the library, faculty librarian Naomi Lader. Naomi and I put together this website which basically pulls together a whole bunch of links to other sites that deal with environmental history. It's a great resource. Okay, so if you go to Colorado State University libraries and you click on there it goes. Okay. Now you got to go up here to search, find, and you go down here to research guides. Well, I think I need your help a little bit. I need to go down here. I need to scroll down a little. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, there we go. Good. Okay. Go here to history. Okay. Oops. Sorry about that. There. And this is where it gets buried. There's Naomi's name. And then you go down, and right there is environmental history. Okay, so here is a really tremendous so I'll have trouble when there we go. Okay. Okay. Key books that deal with environmental history. I'm having trouble making my fingers work, but go to that site, and it's got basic links and resources you can look at. is there any way I can get a scroll on this?
Yeah, I'm gonna get a mouse. If you have 2 fingers on your trackpad up and down, that
Okay.
should,
Yeah, it's not really working. But okay, there we go. All right, okay.
I'll get you a mouse.
All right. There we go. Bibliographies on the web. Here's one, for example. What is environmental history? And you might want to just explore these a little bit. You're set and done.
I think if you use 2 fingers from one hand, it works better.
Oh, okay.
Just put them together, put your fingers together.
Okay. I'm getting it. I guess. Touch. Okay. Now, there's one here in particular that I highly recommend. It's the website of William Cronin. And this is a leading environmental historian. In a lot of ways, Bill Cronin is one of the handful of people who defined environmental history. And his website is a beautiful, it's beautifully constructed, it's extremely useful. You can get all kinds of materials and things on there. So for example, you go to the teaching, and he's got a learning historical research section. Now I realize that this is probably pretty advanced beyond your junior high students, but for you to get ideas, I think this would be very useful. So my website at the library at Colorado State University, and the website William Cronin, if you click on there, there's some really good stuff. Learning to do historical research, a primer for environmental historians and others. If you look on page 17 of the packet, I gave you some instructions there on some resources, some articles, some books, and some other things to take a look at. One of the articles that is not on there that I'm going to talk about a little bit is, while he's doing that, let me point out on the back of that page, on page 18, I've listed several books. One book that I think is worth getting is by Ted Steinberg, Down to Earth, Nature's Role in American History. I mean, I think if you're going to have a handful of books, I won't talk about my own, I won't tout my own, but a book that really should be in your library that I think you'll find extraordinarily useful is by Ted Steinberg, Down to Earth, Nature's Role in American History. So if you can get that, Ted's book, my book, and then if you can get Doug Sackman's Companion to American Environmental History, you'd be really set. You'd have 3 texts you could read and draw upon to work with your students. The Sackman volume is pretty expensive, and maybe you could get your librarian to get that book and put it in the library. There's another article by Cronin, and you can find it on his website, and it's titled TAH Journey. And you can read it there. And it's a beautiful article because it's both a story demonstrating how to do environmental history, but it's also an article that talks about the technical details of the questions that environmental historians ask and the kinds of things that environmental historians do. Sorry about that. That's all right. So Cronin's essay, TAH Journey, is basically premised on his going up to Alaska to an old mining site called Kennecott. And there he tells you this environmental history story. He's a beautiful writer about the environmental history of that place. But along the way, he also explains how to do environmental history. And there are all kinds of questions and concepts in there that I think you can draw upon to think up exercises for your students. So I highly recommend that essay. And when Glenn gets that going, I can show you where that is.
Where do I want to go?
Okay, let's see.
Back to the environmental history place.
Okay, so go down here and go right there. Printer. There it is. Okay, so go to writing. Okay, and go to books. Okay, go down. Okay, click on there. There it is. Okay. Yeah, there's scroll down. Show it. There we go. Kennecott Journey to Paths Out of Town. And that subtitle might be suggestive. Cronin says that one of the ways to do environmental history is to follow the pathways of people and things. And that's a great metaphor, I think, for working with students. What sorts of things do people bring to a place like Kennecott, a very remote place? What sorts of organisms are plants and animals, industrially mass-produced goods are moving into that place? So that metaphor of the journey, the pathway, is a very good one. So Cronin's essay, Kennecott Journey to Paths Out of Town, might be useful. Okay, so maybe what we can do is begin by talking about environmental history a little bit. I always think one of the most important things to do is what Glenn started to have me do, which is to define it. What is environmental history? And I included a page here. It's on page 11. I always use this with my own students. I even find that history majors are a little bit fuzzy on what history actually is, and I don't think we need to go through that, but I do usually take students through a whole review of what history is, how we think about it, because it's a lot, as you know, more complicated than what people usually superficially think about it. But one of the ways to begin is just to define environmental history, and I think all of the definitions that you were coming up with were very workable and very good. One of the first things I tell people is it's about the role and place of nature in human life through time. That's kind of the nutshell version, the thumbnail version, so to speak. The role and place of nature in human life through time. Or it could be the interaction of people and nature through time. So those are very basic definitions, but of course it gets really abstract. You know, what do we mean by that? And one of the things you have to do is begin pulling apart some of the terms. One of the basic questions that's at the heart of environmental history is, what is nature? And that's something I think maybe we can spend a little time talking about. But what is nature? And furthermore, are people inside or outside of nature? It almost gets very philosophical, even theological, and there are multiple points of view on this. There's no one set answer. I think these are eternal questions. These are eternal questions that as long as there are people on planet Earth, they will be asking and debating about. So what is nature, and are people inside or outside of nature or not? So maybe we could talk about that. What do you think? We're trying to come up with some definition of environmental history, and we're trying to understand what nature is. What do you think? What's nature? It's an easy thing to say. There's a British scholar, a literary historian named Raymond Williams. He's dead now, but he wrote an essay titled Ideas of Nature, and he actually went through the Oxford English Dictionary. And he said that nature is one of the most complex words in the English language. It's one of those words that has many, many, many definitions, sometimes conflicting. But I think if you want to understand what environmental history is, you have to confront that issue. What is nature? So what do you think? What is nature? Yeah, what do you think?
The surrounding environment, like natural resources.
Okay, the surrounding environment. And that's a great thing to point out, because nature has this relationship to this other word, environment. What's environment? Are nature and environment synonymous, or are they different? In what ways are they different? And so you got to ask that question. You know, environment implies to environ. It implies a surrounding. So that may not be exactly the same thing as nature, even though environmental historians themselves often use the two interchangeably. But it is something to think about.
Nature would be inside of the environment, wouldn't it?
What's that?
We live in the environment, and then nature is also in the environment.
Okay,
the
so,
natural things surrounding us in the
We
okay,
can also back to ideas of place, like where we are geographically, and then physical geography.
and again, I don't have any final answers on this, and this is why it's such a great question, because people can say all kinds of things, and it usually generates a really great discussion. So,
Isn't one of the questions you asked, are we
inside or
inside
outside?
or outside of nature?
Yeah. And I would say that usually, historically, and even down to the present, people have tended to talk about it as if you were outside of nature, or at the very least a special part of the creation. But I think there's a way in which people usually separate themselves out, and there are reasons for that. But usually people talk about people and nature, the interaction of people and nature through time, the role and place of nature in human life through time. So there's a way in which we begin separating out humanity from nature itself. And I think there's reasons for that. I mean, obviously, if it's history, the story ultimately has to be about us, right? We are these actors in the material world. And so on some level, we have to address that, and we have to position people as something distinctive in the world. Okay. But there is a way in which you can also begin to say that people are part of nature. Because what was the first thing you said there? There's a great insight about environment, people's place in the environment. What was it you said?
Our interaction with the surrounding environment.
Our interaction with the surrounding environment. Because I think one of the things you can point out is that the human body itself is an evolved organism. There it is. Through our bodies, we are part of the creation. We are nature too. And one of the things that environmental historians have done such a great job of is pointing out that it's impossible to differentiate a human body from the environment in which it is living, through which it is moving. Because you're taking in air, you're taking in water, you're taking in nutrients. Genetically, they can even find out what sorts of things you tend to eat. So one's environment is wrapped up in one's body. So one of the things that environmental historians have tried to do is collapse that boundary between people and nature. They've tried to draw the two together. And it can lead to problems in a variety of ways. But that's one of the things they've done. Environmental history started out basically assuming that people were outside of nature, that people were acting upon nature and nature acting upon people. And then over time, what they've tried to do is to break that down. And they look at things like diseases. They look at things like food. They look at things like energy. And pretty soon, once you start focusing on those things, it's hard to say that people are not, in some sense, natural too. Now, that is a huge thing, and this is something worth thinking about. To say that people are part of nature and thus are subject to it, subject to some of its limitations, is a pretty big move. It is a bold, audacious, some might say foolish move on the part of historians to make such a claim. One of the things that historians have done very well, especially historians in the United States, is to talk about history in terms of the human quest for autonomy and freedom. What could be more American than that, right? The story of, I don't know if you've ever read Eric Foner's book, The Story of American Freedom. Great book. And so one of the things that the modern history discipline, which came together in the late 19th century, has done is to talk about people in terms of this great story of people struggling to liberate themselves from slavery, of struggling to assert their will. Historians like to call it agency. One of the things that social historians have done is to go to great lengths to demonstrate that even people such as those who were enslaved, women, American Indians, and so forth, on some level were able to exercise agency. At some level, they were able to determine their own fates. So that's a real powerful trope it's a very powerful way of talking about the past. And if you start thinking about it, you realize how much historical thinking has gone into that effort, how much American history, as Professor Foner pointed out in his book, is really written about that movement. But then when you say that people are part of nature, that starts to complicate that story. There's an Australian ethicist, a guy named Clive Hamilton. And Clive Hamilton says that we've understood humanity in terms of what he calls human exceptionalism. And there, human exceptionalism, that's that notion that people are not part of nature. That's that notion that people are, separate from the material world, from the physical world. And that and then to tell people that no, in fact, you're living in a condition which inherently imposes limits on you, is to call into question that great story of struggling for freedom. So that's one of the problems that you have to deal with environmental history. So, any questions so far? How many of you've actually read portions of my book? Okay. So have you read any of Elliot's book or Thomas's book? A little bit. It's not as if this is entirely new. It's not as if this is entirely new, but one of the documents you might want to take a minute and read over and let's talk about is by John Dewey, a selection from Democracy and Education, which was published in 1916. But why don't we take a few minutes and quickly go through this. Here's a primary source, and let's reflect after you've read this on what you think environmental history is and where maybe it came from. So environmental history tends to tell us a fairly simple story about itself. You hear the old timers. They'll say, yeah, back in 1972 or something like this, and I've heard this story so many times. We were all meeting at the American Historical Association convention and Carolyn and I got together and we started talking about this. And it's really about the influence of the environmental movement upon the discipline of history. And it's not that it's wrong, but it's sort of, most disciplines tell a sunny story about themselves. But actually, environmental history is much older, it's much deeper. It was interesting to me when I stumbled across this discussion of what I think is environmental history by John Dewey almost a century ago, this leading philosopher, educational theorist, and so forth. So what do you make of Dewey? What do you think Dewey is trying to do in this statement?
Showing the interconnectedness of people and nature and how basically the things we do are driven by what happens in nature.
Yeah, okay. So basically the things that we do are driven by humanity's place in nature, okay? Okay, yeah.
He's trying to change perspectives, the way it ends with his last three big words. Otherwise, you have the wrong educational attitude.
Okay, okay.
It's a little blunt, but it makes the point that you need to see things differently.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's a way in which he's saying if you separate people out from nature, there's a tendency to fragment knowledge and it becomes more boring. If you take history out of geography, geography out of history, it tends to become more fragmented. He's really dealing with the problem of the fragmentation of the disciplines. He's really trying to get people to see the connections between things. And for me, the real telling sentence is there in the middle of that second paragraph. Nature is the medium of social occurrences. It furnishes original stimuli. It supplies obstacles and resources. Civilization is the progressive mastery of its varied energies, and so forth. And I think most history has been written, as Patty Limerick, one historian, said, is that people are, live a foot off the ground. Nature is treated as this scenic backdrop. It's the stage, it's the backdrop on which the drama of history is played out. And here Dewey is telling us that's wrong. It's not the stage setting, it's not the stage scenery, the backdrop and all that. It is part of the story. Environmental historians will go even further and say it is one of the actors out there on the stage. So I think that one of the things you'll always have to deal with, we always wrestle with, is getting people to call into question that basic divide between people and nature. If you look on the bottom of the basic sheet on page 11, toward there, and I've got the slashed lines between the divisions that people in our culture often make. We often speak of the difference between nature and culture. We often make the distinction between the natural and the artificial. We often make a distinction between Ron Gustavus Levi-Strauss, the French anthropologist. He said that the central problem of anthropology is the transformation of nature into culture. And he talked about all these primitive cultures as he imagined them, dealing with this fundamental transition, moving from the raw to the cooked, the unmade and the made, and so forth. So I think there's a way in which, at least in Western civilization, there's a powerful impetus to draw a distinction between these things. That's right there is what Clive Hamilton calls human exceptionalism, as if we are somehow apart from the rest of the material creation. So really, I think what we're trying to do is show those things are connected. Yeah, there is a thing called culture. Yeah, that culture is largely a function of our imaginations. It's very intangible. It's somewhere in this weird organ of the brain. We can think virtually anything we want. And it's hard to put your finger on that. What's real about that in a material, substantive way? Yes, there is culture. Yes, we do create artificial things. This table, for example, the shirt I'm wearing, and so forth. We manufacture things that we, in some reasonable sense, can call artificial. We take raw stuff and we cook it into food. There's unmade stuff out there in the world, and we take that and we make something. But we're really talking about the interrelations between these things. We're talking about the connection between culture and nature. We're talking about the connection between the natural and the artificial. I mean, I always find it funny, here's this table, and this tabletop's made out of plastic, which is made out of oil, and then they tried to make the tabletop look like wood, something natural. And so I actually think that Levi Strauss is right. People are obsessed with that connection, and they go over and over and over and over it again and again and again. Somehow we're obsessed with raw stuff that people haven't, in some reasonable sense, affected, and then taking that and transforming it into something else, something useful to society. It's a fundamental process of being human. And if you talk about those relationships between nature, culture, natural, artificial, raw, cooked, made, and so forth, you're actually coming up with a definition of environmental history. Whatever it means to be human, whatever it means to think things, to create ideas, organizations, societies, all kinds of practices to make stuff, and how that relates to that material world, the planet, the universe, the creation, whatever you want to call it, that process is the essence of environmental history. So it's an interesting thing. Maybe you can, toy with that with your students, get them to talk about what is nature, and then call into question some of the assumptions that they are inevitably going to have about it. It's a real powerful thing. To talk about people as distinct from everything else has enabled people to do some pretty miraculous things, without a doubt. All of the material benefits that we enjoy today, in many ways, flow from that distinction. But separating ourselves out and imagining the world as resources that we can manipulate and turn into useful stuff, it's really powerful. But yet it also tends to obscure, it tends to hide the ways that, in fact, we can never escape the material world we're in. We can never escape the fact that ultimately everything is part of the natural world. Okay. So one of the things I've done there is I'll also put some other concepts down there that are useful to think about nature in ways that people, at least in Western societies, think about nature. Oftentimes there's kind of a metaphor that underlies the language of how people are talking about nature. Nathan was showing me some of the primary sources, newspaper articles that he's going to give you when we do the mining exercises. And implicit in the one that he and I were looking at was an organic metaphor. It was the earth as a living organism. And there are words in there that are very organic. And that's a concept, it's actually an ancient concept to imagine the world as an organic thing. Another powerful metaphor that people often employ in talking about the world is a mechanical one. The earth and the universe are as if they're machinery. A mechanical metaphor that there's a biologist, Paul and Ann Ehrlich. They're famous biologists at Stanford University, and they wrote a popular book about biology. It's titled The Machinery of Nature. The Machinery of Nature. So you often hear people talk about the natural world on those terms. Nature as a divine or sacred order. I mean, that's really powerful. I mean, one of the things that you might want to have your students do is read Genesis. That's great. That is a powerful primary source. I can't think of a more fundamental primary source to begin thinking about environmental history in Western societies than to go back and read Genesis, because there it is. There's the divine order that's implicit in everything. And that sense powerfully governed how Americans, through the 19th century, down to the 20th, even down to the present, have thought about the natural world. Oftentimes people talk about nature in terms of progress or decline. Is our story fundamentally a story of, if you could chart it out, is the graph going up? Are things getting better? Are we increasing our mastery over the natural world to produce things, food, clothing, energy, etc., that make our lives easier and better and allow people to live longer? Is that the story? Is it a story of progress, or is it fundamentally a story of decline? Are we messing things up? What would you say based on Genesis? Is the story, if you extrapolate from Genesis, is the story one of progress or decline?
Decline.
Yeah, in what sense?
We're destroying everything.
Okay, and what is the, I mean, it's the fall from grace, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's the fall from grace. So once it was a garden, everything was great, people made
Gorgeous, all
mistakes.
the animals, all the kind of,
Yeah.
anything you can want, luscious.
Yeah.
It's also the story of progress, though, when you think about the human self-awareness and their ability to identify
Yeah.
what's going on around them and how they interact with it.
Yeah.
Which was, it's a fall upward for human. It may be a fall downward for environment, but it's a fall upward.
Okay, yeah, and that's really interesting. One of the things I do with my students is talk about a federal government agency in the Arid West, the Bureau of Reclamation. So, reclaiming, reclamation, where do we get that? You know, what does that mean? To reclaim means to take back. Something that you once had, you're getting it back. And I really think that in that term, reclamation, which was a term widespread late 19th, early 20th centuries, it's still used today, it's still there in the Bureau of Reclamation's title, is a connection to that story of Genesis, the fall from grace, and now we're going to take it back. I wrote a book. The first book I wrote was titled Irrigated Eden, The Making of an Agricultural Landscape in the American West. And it was about southern Idaho on the Snake River, and that notion of reclaiming something, the remnants of the fall from grace, the wreckage, so to speak, the deserts, the wastelands, and then we're going to apply water to it, much as happened in Eden long ago, and we're going to put it back into some semblance of a garden. And so for people whose sense of themselves in relation to the world is powerfully conditioned by their reading of the Bible, I mean, it's pretty important. And so progress or decline, there probably is no ultimate answer to that. It's one of those eternal perennial questions that we're thinking about. I don't know what you do with junior high students. I do remember being 13-year-old when I was, and the kinds of things that govern the mindset of a pubescent boy. So maybe it's pretty hard to engage in this kind of discussion. But for you yourselves, I think it's really worth thinking about. So one of the things, another thing to think about when you're dealing with environmental history, I mean, all of you are coming up with really good definitions of it. And it really is something about the interaction between people and their material circumstances, their biophysical, geophysical circumstances. One of the things to do is to sharpen that analysis a little bit. And what I'm going to describe is basically standard in the environmental history field. You can read various articles that will essentially say much the same thing. One of them is Cronin's essay, TAH June. But if you look on the bottom there, basically environmental historians will think about environmental history in terms of three categories. One is ecology, one is production, the other one is cognition, nature, economy, and ideas. And all of these are interacting at once. There is a material, biophysical, geophysical context for human life. We can call it nature. People are embedded in that material world. They are of that material world. They shape that material world. They're connected to it in ecological relationships. That's a reality. And that's an ongoing process of change. Those relationships, that condition, is an ongoing process of change. But at the same time, people do things to manipulate that natural world. They do things to produce the things that they need to live. And we call that economy. Agriculture, mining, manufacturing, you name it. People are doing all kinds of things to shape the material world in order to produce the things that people need to live. There's a third category to keep in mind, and that's the realm of ideas. It's what people do in the world and how they respond to the changes that are going on out there are powerfully shaped by the ideas that they have. Genesis does matter. Scientific notions do matter. Ideas of whether or not people are inside or outside of nature do matter to the choices that people will make in the world, how they will respond to things that are going on out there, storms and diseases and droughts and so forth. So it's really a matter of looking at the continual interaction of those three things: nature, economy, and ideas. There are ideas of nature that shape how people relate to it. Okay? So questions about this?
Well,
Yeah.
Use Genesis in the creation story, or have you thought of any of the parallels in creation stories that you've seen from other cultures?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and you know, a really obvious one that would be really good is American Indian cultures. You know, and so Elliot's going to talk about American Indians, and he's going to talk. And so I'm not going to emphasize that as much. You can get that from him. But yeah, one of the really great things that you can do with students is to, and they're out there, they're all over the place. There's probably some links on the website for my library webpage, but which is to deal with American Indian creation stories there. So there's some, you know, there's some basic distinctions that you can make there. I mean, for one thing, a lot of American Indian creation stories are stories of emergence. They come out of the ground. If you've ever been to Pecos Pueblo, if you've ever gone down to you know, Santa Fe or Albuquerque, and there's Pecos Pueblo, which is a national park site, you can actually go down into a kiva, you know, which is a below ground, sacred, ceremonial space, and then you can climb out on the ladder and come into the light. And every time they do that, they're reenacting that story of emergence. So most American Indians have some story about coming out of the earth in some way. You know, once they, you know, the crow or coyote opens himself up and outsteps the first person. American Indians often, in days of yore, back to the time of creation, often were related, had a relationship with some particular animal and so forth. The Pawnee Indians, you know, descended from the stars, a little bit different, but nonetheless, they're usually these stories that are emerging from the materiality. Whereas in Christianity, people are created in the image of God. You know, a really great juxtaposition in Pecos Pueblo is that underground ceremonial space, and right next to it is the church with the steeple pointing upward. You know, so they're coming at it from two different directions in many ways. But I think that's something that students can relate to. So yeah, different ways of approaching it.
Kids, you know, you made a comment, how you do this with middle school kids or whatever. One of the coolest things, or one of the things that the kids like the most that I do is, it's just a homesteading activity.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I wasn't really ever much into environmentalism. I mean, just didn't ever think about it that way. Until we've been exposed to it a little bit during this grant. And in the simulation that we do, they figure out that no matter how hard the people worked on the claims and all these things, their success and failure ultimately comes down to nature, environment, weather, climate, rain, no rain. You know, whether where they decided to settle it has soil that's good for it. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
and they just kind of it brings the nature, I guess. And I've never thought of it this way, but more instead of just a backdrop or a scenery, more as an actor in the equation. I mean, that it has a role, that nature is directly involved with success, failure, or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great exercise, is to get students outside doing something, you know, growing stuff, you know, hunting for, you know, for food, water, etc. Yeah, no, I think that's really excellent.
On what he said, we watched the PBS special Frontier House,
Yeah,
and even if they make all the right decisions, there's a huge hailstorm in the middle of June, wipes out their gardens.
yeah,
And the narrator talks about some blizzard in 1888 where the sheep ate the wool off of each other, most of the cattle died.
Yeah.
You know, you can't plan for that. Nature is, but one of the characters in the show who's suffering through all that says, you know, Mother Nature just, when you're standing up, reminds you that you're tiny.
Yeah.
And they knock you down and it's time to get up again, but you need to be ready because you never know what's coming.
Yeah. And, you know, so, oh, go ahead.
I've told my husband for years that we could either buy seed to plant or we could go to Las Vegas and gamble the money, you know, either way, because nature plays such a significant role, whether there's a problem.
Yeah, maybe people in agriculture will understand that more clearly than people who aren't working the land like that. That's my sense of it. But in a lot of ways, think of all the things that modern society has done to try to shield people from those kinds of vulnerabilities. Think of all the things that go into that. The energy production systems, food production systems, government programs, and so forth that try to shield people from the consequences of their actions. Thomas, his book Killing for Coal, is one of the reasons that book is so excellent because he talks about the centrality of coal to the modern world. How much of what we have, including agriculture, we don't have unless we have that energy source. It's phenomenal. And that energy abundance, some historians believe, powerfully affected, shaped, conditioned the discipline of history itself. There's a professor at Notre Dame University, Julia Thomas, and she thinks that the ways that the history discipline, history professors, history teachers came to look at the world was conditioned by that energy abundance. It essentially exempted people from having to ask really hard questions about human life. We could focus on freedom, the story of American freedom. We could focus on the story of people struggling to exercise agency, will, exercising their autonomy, creating democracy, and so forth, precisely because they didn't have to worry about energy. And now, increasingly, we're having to talk about it a little bit more. So she thinks that historians are not very well equipped to deal with some of the issues that we're confronting now, because our very discipline lacks the language, lacks the concepts to talk about the human experience in these ways. I don't agree with her, because there's Dewey, there's John Dewey in 1916 calling our attention to the fact that nature is not the stage, it's not the scene, it's not the backdrop, it's part of the story itself. So I think people have always been thinking those things. But I do believe that in the United States, where we're the Saudi Arabia of coal, look at the oil we're still getting out of the ground now. Look at our superabundance, our soils. Kansas is a great example of that. The water that we have, all of the fabulous resources that the United States has, basically underlay the ways that historians in this country came to see the world. And that is, hey, you know, we're making progress. We're mastering our environment. We're creating lots of food. We're warm. And we're eliminating disease. And there's powerful evidence that people are doing all those things. So let's talk about what really matters, you know. And then they talk about the Civil War. They talk about presidents. They talk about slavery and so forth. As if it's all about people struggling for freedom, of extricating themselves from things that were once constraining them. And then environmental historians like me show the scene and say, you know what, you can't escape it. We are constrained. It's very interesting seeing the reaction of my colleagues in social history to environmental history. They're very uncomfortable with it. They're very nervous about it. They tend to resist it. And I think it's because we call into question that fundamental story. I mean, if you're a historian of women and gender, your whole career, your whole way of looking at the world has been trying to point out the ways that patriarchy constrained women, you know, and women asserted their sense of self and autonomy, you know, and gained political rights and so forth. It's a powerful story, it really is. And then someone shows up on the scene and says, you know what, that's not all it's about. People live in a material context that has real limits on it. We may think they're not there because we've benefited from the abundance of the earth, coal, oil, and so forth. But if you look at the vast sweep of human history, people live within constraints. And they're always knocking on the door trying to get in, into the super protected and materially abundant parts of the United States. So,
question of environment, didn't it used to play a bigger role in the way we taught our American history because of the difference in environment in the North, where they turned to trade because the land was so terrible to farm, and the South, who didn't get involved in manufacturing trade as much because they had an easy agricultural economy that they could just fall into free labor source. I mean, to me, as it applies to us, that's a pretty quick way to see environment, if not nature, the environment, and how from the 1600s to the 1800s, it all kind of helped us evolve into having a civil war.
Yeah, and I think you're asking a good question, and we can reflect on that, and I did include some documents that speak to that observation you're making. One is two statements about the natural limits for non slavery, one by John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina statesman, the other by Abraham Lincoln. You know, and Calhoun basically says there are going to be natural limits to slavery, don't worry about its extension, and Lincoln says there are no natural limits to it. So I think historians, even environmental historians, would probably say that environment doesn't necessarily impose a constraint on it. New York had a lot of slaves. I have a colleague at Brown University, Carl Jacoby, pointed out that there was this giant dairy farm outside of Providence that had slaves on it. You know, slaves can be virtually everywhere. You know, it wasn't but a few years back that National Geographic pointed out that there are something like 25 million humans today working under some condition of bonded servitude. So slavery is still alive and well, and I don't think it's necessarily limited by environment. But there are choices made, you know, about labor systems, in particular environmental settings, cotton, rice, sugar, tobacco, and so forth. You know, and so that's one of the riddles. That's one of the things to try to sort out is the environmental history of slavery, why one section of the country became more centered upon it, and the other did not. You know, what the consequences of that were. So maybe at some point some historian can make a stronger argument that environment did determine that the South would be a slave society and the North not. But at this point, I don't think environmental historians are willing to go there. They don't see it as quite that kind of determinism. But it's a good question. It's a good insight. Yeah. Essential thing to ask. So one of the things to think about is what's environmental history for? What use is it? Why pay attention to it? One of the documents that I pulled out to take a look at, maybe we want to take a look at it and reflect a little bit upon it, is it's on page 3. Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. I mean, it's really interesting, you know. Some of you who do have degrees in history of political science, if you've read Burke, having written The Republic of Nature, I'm about willing to think that nature is present in most historical texts. It was present in most political documents. It was a subject of discussion in most political debates. You know, probably for all the reasons that we expunged it from the study of history, we've forgotten to pay attention to those key words that appear in classic texts like Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Maybe some of you have read it. Burke was this, he's now one of the key conservative theoreticians. And Burke was a staunch opponent of the French Revolution, believed it had been a mistake, believed that it was too destructive, that it tore down the established structures of society and so forth, and plunged France into chaos. He favored the American Revolution. He felt that Americans had changed in a slow, gradual kind of way, and thus they deserved their independence. But Burke has become a key text in conservative thought. But if you go through Burke, if you read it, you can actually see him talking about things. He's talking about nature. He actually begins to talk about conservation. So why don't we take a look at this and see if we can distill from it some message from Burke about about the human predicament and why in this nature might be important, thus why environmental history might be important. So I think Thomas is going to talk about conservation. So you can get into these issues more deeply. But it's a really interesting link between conservatism and conservation. About 30 years ago, I heard a debate between a guy named Henry Steele Commager, who was a real prominent U.S. historian. He's dead now. And he was also a very outspoken liberal. And his opponent was William Rusher, who was the publisher of the National Review, which is William F. Buckley's magazine, still a well-read conservative journal. And at one point in the debate, Commager challenged Rusher and said, well, I don't see why conservatives are not also conservationists. And of course, then Russia argued against that, but it was a really interesting point. Here I was reading reflections on the revolution in France, and stumbled across this passage in which Burke starts talking about conservation. And he starts talking about it in relation to conservatism. He starts talking about nature. So what do you make of this? What do you think? What do you think nature is? I know you had to read it quickly. It's, you know, an 18th century text and all that. But what's going on in this? What do you think nature is according to Burke, and what's the central point he's trying to put over it?
I thought it was really interesting. It says the incorporation of the human race moves on through the various pillar of perpetual decay, fall, renovation, and progression. I just think the margins. Middle school thinking, circle of life, Lion King,
Okay.
the whole
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
regeneration.
Regeneration. Okay. I think that's relevant, actually. Yeah. What do you think?
I took from it that we understand that nature is good and important and part of who we are, because what I took was we want to give this to future generations. We may not know what it is, but there's something about nature and our relationship with it that is important enough that we have to take care of it so that it's there for the future,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
No, that really makes sense. And I really think that right at the heart of this is some sense of generational transmission. That we receive things from the past, but what that reception implies is that we're going to give it on to the future. And I think it's open to discussion and deeper question about what exactly Burke means by nature. You know, does he mean nature in a 21st century environmentalist sense? You know, I'm not sure that's quite what he's talking about. But I think there is this sense of, what do you think his sense of nature is?
In his time period, with Locke and Fiege and those guys, nature in Locke's theory would have included our fundamental rights.
Okay.
That nature was contained in them, and so they were not conveyed to us like any God, or even what he says from a generationally from one generation to the next. We may want to protect them for our posterity, but we do not create them so that we can give them to our posterity. In Locke's view, they exist there anyway.
Yeah.
And any group of people can have the same nature and conclude that they want to find a way how their lives protected and yet enjoy them. So in terms of, is this an environmental history kind of idea? I don't know, because during his time period, it would have been that set of ideas that he would have been working with to some extent. And I agree that conservationism is a conservative idea. I think that conservatives have lots of grasp of that. But I do believe that those two things are bound together necessarily.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, there was a popular saying at the time of the American Revolution, self-preservation is the first law of nature. And I think that's a really basic way of making that point, that there's something inherent in humanity. You know, and if you think about it, they are watching people. You know, they are aware. They wouldn't call it the fight or flight response or the flinch response, but they do that. You know, they notice that people instantly defend themselves, and that's very consistent with the Lockean notion of, you know, the body is your property. The fundamental foundation of property is your body. And your application of your bodily labor to nature, to the natural world, creates property. So I think it's on those kind of levels that they do begin to construct some sense of you know, what nature is. Yeah. Now, the extent to which Burke shared that, I think we have to probably tease that out a little bit. But yeah, you know, chapter 2 in my book, by the laws of nature, which is about the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution, kind of tries to get into some of these issues. Yeah, but you know, it's one of the things I learned from doing that book is I think that nature was once at the heart of American political thought. People debated it all the time. One of the I'll point out some online primary sources you can go to, one of which is the collected works of Abraham Lincoln. There's this historian named Roy Basler, and he compiled all known Lincoln writings, and that is now online. You can search it by word, and if you type in the word nature, you get more hits out of Lincoln's writings than you do free labor. Okay? So Lincoln had a lot to say about nature, in fact. And somehow we've isolated nature to the world of what? Henry David Thoreau, to Ralph Waldo Emerson, to John Muir. That's nature. That's nature writing. Lincoln, well, Lincoln had a lot to say about nature. I mean, I wouldn't put him in the exact same category as Thoreau or something like that, but, you know, he had something to say about it. And there are some connections there that I think we can begin to unpack a little bit. By doing that, we basically begin to desegregate nature from the box into which it's been put. It's over there in the biology department, or it's over there in the English department in the nature writing course. You know, one of the writers that I explored more in composing the Republic of Nature was the great historian and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. Maybe some of you have read some of Du Bois's books, The Souls of Black Folk and so forth. I honestly don't see why Du Bois is not considered to be a nature writer. He has an enormous amount to say about nature. If you follow Du Bois into the countryside, you know, you end up out there with a bunch of black laborers struggling in the soil and stuff like that, you know, and that's different from the story if you follow Muir into nature. He takes you up into the high country of the Sierra Nevada. But somehow we've said Muir is the nature guy, Du Bois is not. I think that's a false distinction, and I think there are many other false distinctions which have come to affect or shape how we think about the past. And my purpose as an environmental historian has been to try to get us to draw the connections, to look at Lincoln, for example, and say, you know what, he was a nature guy too. Now, he might not have said it in the exact same way as Thoreau or Muir or something like that, but he was talking about nature. Okay, are we about out of time? Are we okay?
Anytime we can take a break, that you're ready to take a break, and then we'll start back up after the break.
Okay, so what do you think? What do you think of environmental history now?
We watched Last of the Mohicans, and
Yeah.
they're praying to the elk after they kill it,
Yeah.
thanking him for it. And later on, he explains how the Mohicans thought that the sun was God or man, and the earth was a woman, and she died, giving birth to us.
Yeah.
And so that he made the earth her body. My kids are freaked out by it, especially the whole cutting the breast and throwing the milk into the sky against the stars. But they are 8th graders, so they have fun with that. But some of them flash back to 7th grade where we do the samurai. And they have a creation myth, which is the universe takes a giant perfect sword and hits it in the ocean, and 4 drops fall to make the four main islands of Japan.
Interesting.
And so kids who've had me for both of those years routinely make the connection that maybe the way you see your creation affects the way you see your whole life.
Yeah.
Because for samurai, there's no issue about the land. It's about your sword, and they consider their sword their soul.
Yeah.
That's, I've yet to find, I love artifacts, don't get me wrong, but I've yet to find anything that I would look at and go, this thing is my soul.
Yeah.
So that comes up every single year, and I'm always impressed with who asks the question of your creation. I don't know if I could get away with reading Genesis in the classroom. It'd be fun to try maybe the year I retire. It's a nice theory, but I get in trouble. I'm always in trouble. But it is an interesting idea how we see where we come from. Maybe that affects where we're going and how we live.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe that's something that would work well with 7th, 8th, 9th graders, is to have them read some origin stories and, you know, ask them about what this means, see what they make of that. I mean, that's in the ideas of nature category. So maybe that would work. Yeah.
I find that teaching environmental history it's easy to overlook. I never thought about addressing it to the kids as this is environmental history. It's always there and present, and I've never really thought to, okay, what's the environment doing that aids to this or helps add to it? It's easy to overlook because it's there, and this kind of helps bring it out and make the kids have to focus on it a little more rather than just, it's a constant that's always there.
Yeah, maybe one of the things to do is you, the teacher, I don't know how far you can go this with your students, but ask yourself, why is it that way? Why do we just assume it's there and therefore we don't have to talk about it? Why is that? Surely there are historical reasons why that is so. If you talk to my friend Julia over in Notre Dame, she would say it's because when the history discipline came into being, it was a moment of energy abundance, and historians were focused on other things. You know, so I don't know if that's exactly correct or not, but you know, for you yourself to try to sort that out, is why is it that we don't want to talk about this thing that just seems to be everywhere? You know, what is
I
it?
just never really thought about talking about
Yeah.
it specifically, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
I teach archaeology in the afternoon, and
Okay.
it's all about nature. I mean, the Anasazi, and whether or not it was a drought or disease. The Minoan tribe or the Minoan culture that very likely was the tsunami that wiped them out. I mean, so we talk about it all the time.
Yeah. And I would say probably there are certain groups, like geographers will tell me this, you know, ecologists will tell me this, and archaeologists will say, hey, this is new to you guys, but it's not new to us. I mean, we're out there taking the curve, so yeah, there it is.
Yeah, well, building on that, I was just gonna say the sixth graders, because sixth grade is ancient history for me, and they seem to pick up on those ideas so much faster. Kids in eighth grade, yeah, kids in eighth grade who are so used to, here's my history pigeonhole, I'm not going to look outside it.
Yeah.
And the sixth graders are like, oh, well, the Nile River flooded, and because of that, this happened, because of that, this happened.
So why do you think that is what they're getting in the curriculum?
History's so segmented, I think. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
Yeah, the
when you read a historian, it comes out as, you know, that this is their topic.
Yeah.
They're gonna talk about this, and they get so, I think sometimes, and we or they or whoever gets so wrapped up in what that specific topic is, that you just solely focus on that. I mean, if you look back in like European, you know, when they talked about, you know, the king, when they were ruled by the king, this is the king's horse, the king's deer, the king's this, the king's that, you know, it was all kind of tied together. Well, now, if you get into the Civil War, you know, you may have a guy that's his deal is Gettysburg, and that's, you know, it's what he's gonna talk about, or she, or whoever's doing the research.
I almost, like, a frequent complaint I heard was, why are you teaching us economics? Why are you teaching us geography? Why can't you just give us the answer? You know, why don't you give more worksheets? And it's because kids are like trained, you know, these are, I need to memorize A, B, C, and D, you know, and that's the way they've been taught history, or at least in my school district, that's the way they've been. And they go from like these ancient civilizations where they have to think about how the geography influenced human culture directly, like to use the earlier example of Egypt and Nile River, how that affected trade and really essential progress. And then we pick them up and drop them in eighth grade, which theoretically starts at 1800, and say, oh, well, we're in North America now, there's starting to be a division of the economies. I can't really get into why because we only have 8 months, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So the same observations, insights, questions they would have about that ancient world, they can't see the same things in modern society.
They don't
you know?
carry that over
Yeah,
at all.
and it's probably not their fault. It's something that our society, our culture is giving them, and we're conditioning the ways that they think about it. And now I guess I hope that environmental history can be some means to sort of break down those distinctions and, you know, make the connections again. And I think that one of the best ways to do it is to go right into the heart of the subject matter itself, is to go right into the middle of the Civil War and say, what's environmental history about this? You mean it didn't matter? Soil, climate, disease, and so forth didn't matter to the Civil War? Really? You really believe that? You know, and I think once people start investigating, it's harder and harder to really make that point. So maybe that's one way to do it.
If you go back to what Jill was talking about, the whole idea I never thought about when I was teaching middle school the same way. It's like, here's the event. I didn't think about how the, you know, weather and disease and soil and rain impacted the Battle of Gettysburg. I was one of those Gettysburg guys that it was 6 weeks, baby, because it was off there. Yeah, we're going to do it. I'm having fun, and nobody else, I don't care. We don't think about that environmental piece. And I know that a lot of you have gone through this, but if you haven't, and even if you have, there's 4 or 5 chapters in here that are specific to the 1800s that really give you that sort of sense of, oh, really? A bunch of hogs died in Virginia, so we invade Pennsylvania and get involved in Gettysburg? I never knew that when I was teaching. And so the nice thing about Mark's book that I really like is that it's broken up into chunks and it's very readable and very useful. And I can take that information and embed it into some of the stuff that I'm doing with my kids. And so I would really encourage you to go back to this as you start to plan your lessons and units for next year and you think about this environmental piece that we haven't thought about before. There's some incredibly useful information in here and it's chunked out. It's not like I gotta read the whole book to get the point of what he's talking about. It's like, here's Gettysburg, here's Cotton, here's Lincoln, here's trains, here's exactly the stuff that you are being asked to teach. And it talks about all of the things that Mark has mentioned, the weather and the soil and the disease and those things. It's very useful. So dig into this next fall when you start trying to think about what you're going to do. And it goes back to Jill's observation. So I appreciate you saying that. I never thought about trying to tie those things together. And when we do, it helps kids start to make sense of what we're asking them to think about.
And just to add a little bit to what Glenn is saying here, if you read the Gettysburg chapter, the last section of that chapter is titled Ghosts. And it begins with the observation of two historians. One is Bruce Catt. And those of you who are Civil War historians or buffs know his name. He's one of the great popular historians of the Civil War. The other one is Richard Sellers, who is an historian of the National Park Service. And they both made this observation about Gettysburg, that they think it's all this nice manicured landscape now. Lots of grass, and it's nice, and people show up for picnics and do stuff. It's a place for these happy memories. Where's the battle? Where's the trauma? And if you think about all of those middle-class families going to Gettysburg on their outings, having picnics, they're going in automobiles, it's a moment of hydrocarbon abundance. It's a moment when people can afford not to have to think directly about that awful material, physical reality of what happened in that place. So it could be that the way the Park Service managed it for at least a while was a manifestation of that abundance that characterized American society for so long. And then people stopped thinking about the disease. They stopped thinking about the hogs. They stopped thinking about the terrain, the climate, things like that. That might have something to do with it. Yeah. Okay, so
Yeah, we're going to take a break. Perfect timing. Let's come back at 10:30.